Hello, everyone. Today on Courageous Custody, recognizing the signs of grooming, protecting your child in a custody battle. Hi, I'm Renee Rodriguez.
Hi, I'm Achra Tarfa. Let's dive into this topic, Renee.
Yeah, first reminder, we're not giving legal advice or therapy.
Yes, and if you are feeling triggered, please step away and join us again. Take care of yourself.
And so today we're going to talk about grooming. We're going to talk about documenting specific behaviors around it, presenting evidence strategically in court, looking through a trauma lens, and lastly, reasons why protective parents might be disbelieved or even penalized and possibly lose custody of their children for reporting the grooming behaviors. Showing family court that your abusive co-parent is grooming your child is complex and it's a sensitive thing. It does require careful documentation. It requires you being very strategic throughout this process and having a focus on the specific behaviors that constitute grooming. There's different ways we can approach this. First off, we do want to meticulously document specific behaviors. It's really important to record the details, to start keeping a journal. Note dates, times, locations, and specific instances of your co-parent's interactions with your child that raises red flags. You want to be precise and avoid vague accusations. And when you're documenting, one of the things that we are really looking at is we have parents who are putting together documentation for custody evaluation, for example, or for a hearing or trial. And I'm going to say right now, we're very tentative about calling it grooming or calling it child sexual abuse or anything like that, largely because, and we'll talk about this at the end, what can happen to protective parents who bring those accusations forward. So we like to frame it under something different so that the court is aware of what's going on, but that you aren't coming forward and calling it grooming or anything like that. It should be. We are here to say right off the bat that you should be able to speak frankly, but we need to be strategic about it basically because we know what can happen. So the focus really needs to be on grooming behaviors. And it may be that we're looking at calling it, I like to call things poor judgment. For example, I like to give it a name that will allow the court to actually hear, to be open to hearing what they're hearing and letting them decide for themselves, but making it as plain as day what seems to be going on. So it's important then to familiarize yourself with the stages and the tactics of grooming. Again, understanding that the court probably doesn't know them. So what you're bringing forward is you want to choose the stuff that will help even an ignorant family court, should you be in one, to raise their eyebrows, that will allow them to say that's not okay. So sometimes you can include some things that are obvious. If you have an evaluator who is well informed of this, you do want to bring up the excessive attention and gifts, like lavishing the child with inappropriate or overly expensive gifts, praise or attention that seems manipulative. Is there secrecy that's happening? Is there special treatment for one child? Are boundaries being violated? Right? Physical affection that feels inappropriate for the relationship, overly long hugs, touching in private areas, encouraging the child to touch them inappropriately, baths and showers, anything to do with bathing suits, anything that is violating boundaries, right? Sexualized language or innuendo, if they're using language with sexual undertones or making inappropriate jokes or comments in front of or directed at the child, you're going to want to document that. Wherever they are undermining your authority, like when they're disregarding your rules or parenting decisions, something we go across the board, but if you're tying it to someone who is grooming, this could be something that you're bringing in, as well as isolation of the child. Again, something that can be very general, but if it's something that has to do with grooming, you want to tie that in, especially if they're limiting the child's contacts with you, with friends, with extended family of yours, or even theirs, right? Or other supportive individuals. If they are creating a dependency with the child, making the child feel that they need the co-parent for emotional support, and it's in an unhealthy way. And also, this is a big one. What is the online activity? Document any inappropriate online interactions, even friend requests from unknown adults they connect with through the co-parent, or if the co-parent encourages online secretive behavior, document that. You want to preserve communications. Save all the emails, texts, social media messages, voicemails from your co-parent that demonstrate these behaviors or attempt to manipulate your kiddo or your relationship with them as well. You also want to gather all of this evidence together. The child statements, for example, if they're disclosing anything concerning, you want to document their exact words, the context, and your immediate response as well. You have to be careful not to lead their statements. You have to be careful to simply ask questions and wait for the answer. When you do follow-up questions, you're in dangerous territory. So you really have to navigate this very carefully. You also want the observation of others. If other trusted adults, like teachers or therapists, family members, friends, anybody, have observed concerning interactions between your co-parent and your kiddo, ask those people to document their behaviors. Have them just send you an email saying, hey, I observed this and it bothered me because it was this and this. And they need to have the details. They need to have specifics. What was the date? Who was there? All of it. Because their objective accounts can be very powerful. Seek professional opinions. Get help for your kiddo. A therapist, especially a play therapist or someone who is familiar with sexual abuse, some sort of even a school counselor experienced in child abuse, trauma, sexual abuse, can assess your child's emotional well-being and identify potential signs of grooming. Their professional experience, honestly, and their reports, that's what's going to create crucial evidence for you. And then take a look at school records. Hey, note any changes in your child's behavior, in academic performance, in social interactions reported by the school. We've had clients where their children have exhibited sexualized behavior, groomed behavior. They're acting things out with other kids on the playground. This often shows up with something that's disciplinary, with something coming from a teacher's observation or a school counselor. This is excellent documentation to have, and they can be indicators of distress. I'm not going to pretend that, again, I have to remind you that will the court see it as that? Growing a bunch of things, right? So you want to be strategic about this. Work with your attorney closely, but you want to make sure that your attorney is familiar with grooming cases, that they're willing to focus on facts and behaviors. And then you want to present the document evidence in a clear and organized and factual manner. When you are presenting, by the way, you don't want to be emotional. You don't want your personal opinions. You don't want to assess what you think it is, because that'll make a huge difference and will really hurt your case. Stick to just what you observed, what others have reported, just the facts, right? And then you want to be able to connect those behaviors to grooming tactics. Again, you want to figure out how is it that you are going to put this out there. And listen, for my money, it's always got to be some other professional who is calling it grooming or anything like that. They have to be the one using those terms. For the protective parents, what I find works best, unfortunately, again, is saying something like concerning behavior and odd behavior and distress and anything where you're not calling it sexual abuse, you're not calling it grooming, but you have to be aware of it. Right? You have to be careful of how you are saying it in family court. Now, let's pause for a minute, because if something very clearly happens, then you have to call CPS. But a huge word of caution here as well, because parents feel like they can call CPS and get something going. And I feel like if there's somebody else, anybody else who is observing this behavior, you're going to want them to be the ones calling CPS, because if you are in a custody battle, you calling CPS can be used against you. Again, your child's well-being comes first. If you have to call CPS, you call CPS. But if somebody else is identifying it, ask them to be the ones to call CPS so that CPS will take it seriously and as much as they can. So you're going to need to get expert testimony as well, right? You're going to want to find people who are familiar with grooming and that type of thing. And when it comes down to it, you're going to want to figure out, what am I asking for here then? You're going to want to ask for supervised visitation, because it's very difficult, almost no matter what, for the family court to say that an abusive parent should not be allowed to abuse. Sorry to put it that way, but Atra, if you feel like I'm saying this wrongly, please let me know. But it's like the family court wants abusive parents to have custody, right? And so you want to make sure that you have a supervision plan in place that you can offer, that you're restricting the types of communication without saying that you're restricting it or limiting it or using any words that will paint you as the alienator, in spite of the fact that your child is being abused. So you will want to say things more, oh, it works well if they call them at this time, it works well if it's this way, and make sure that you have those restrictions there. You're probably going to need the court's help, but you want to find the right therapist. And honestly, most of the time, if you come in saying this therapist knows something about grooming and sexual abuse, that's going to hurt your chances of getting that therapist. So focus on the therapist's other areas of expertise that also match up with your child. And that way you can get them in there, because I don't know any grooming abusers who are very willing to have a therapist speak to the kiddo, let alone one who is also familiar with grooming. So you want to figure out all of these things, and you want to figure out how can this be used in a custody battle, right? It's really about demonstrating those patterns of behavior and talking about what is in the child's best interests and coming up with the requests that I talked about, supervision and this type of thing. And having a court evaluation can be very helpful as well. But you want to be truthful and accurate and careful. You want to be child-led rather than pointing a finger and say, I don't know what's going on with my kiddo, but my kiddo is exhibiting this behavior, that behavior. And I know that this and this was going on with the other parent. I don't know what's going on. And just basically really lean into what your lawyer is having to say. Proving grooming in family court is challenging. I'm going to say that right now. But it's a crucial step in protecting your child. You can't back off of it. You just have to be strategic about it. You've got the documentation, get the professional support, and a strategic legal approach is going to be essential in order for you to present a compelling case. So we'll talk about reasons why protective parents might be disbelieved or even penalized. But first, let's look at all of this through a trauma lens.
The first thing that comes to my mind is in the context of custody battles, that grooming is not always overt. It can be subtle, it can be manipulative, it can be deeply confusing for both the child and the protective parent. And from an IFS perspective, this situation, it will activate parts in the caregiving parent, in the protective parent, that are hypervigilant, that are angry, that need to fix things fast. There's the exiles that are inside, the vulnerable parts that are holding this fear of any of the things that are needing to be taken care of right now, yesterday. We've got to stop this. And what we can do with internal family systems, with slowing down and recognizing these parts that get triggered when we begin to notice any of these grooming behaviors, whether it's a co-parent trying to isolate the child or confuse their reality or manipulate their trust or love bombing them, these behaviors can re-traumatize not just the child, but also the protective parent. So recognize that, oh, this is re-traumatizing for me as well. And including yourself in that process, not to overtake it, but to be able to actually separate your emotions from what's actually happening to your child so that you can have that clarity, especially if you yourself, especially if the mom themselves had some of their own emotional manipulation in childhood. There can be this sort of deep-seated feelings of empathy that's, oh, it's happening now to my kid. It happened to me. Now it's happening to my kid. And that can really disrupt self-energy. So the way to access that, to stay calm, to stay curious, to be confident is, again, we can begin to separate the feelings, the overwhelming feelings of panic that our protective parts may be holding. And what we can do that, we can assess that situation more clearly. We can communicate with the professionals effectively, and we can support our children without being a party of escalation, without contributing from reactivity to the situation that is already an active traumatizing place. So this framework for helping your child, when children are really coached to recognize their own internal parts, kids have parts too. Kids say that all the time. So they may begin to name confusing feelings of, I got a part of me that's mad. That's okay. Notice when they're being pulled in different directions, because they can feel that way. They can also feel torn. When you can do this, you can help restore trust in their own experience, right? Even if one parent is trying to override, even if one parent is trying to get them to actually self-abandon and not have an identity. And we see this a lot when it comes to these cases. If I can get the child to not have their own identity, to self-abandon and to buy into this grooming behavior, and then do everything that I say and everything that I do, then boom, I have that child and I have an alignment. And that's part of the strategy of coercive control. So again, recognizing that this is a strategy that the other parent can and may and often does use. It's really a deeply concerning thought. Unfortunately, in some family court systems, protective parents can face increased scrutiny. They can even lose custody when raising allegations of abuse that include grooming. That's why it's so important to do what Renee said, which is to allow those labels to be used by the experts, to not give any language from you at all that indicates that. These are just some concerns that I'm seeing. All those things can happen for several complex and often problematic reasons, the reasons why you can get penalized. And I think that you're going to tap into that right now.
Yeah, the reasons why protective parents might be disbelieved or penalized, it's exactly what you're saying, really, which is that parents lose custody over this. The majority of our protective parents come to us when their case has already been started, right? That's when they discover us. That's when they know we exist. And what we find is that the parents who have already talked about grooming or sexual abuse, whatever it might be, they've already lost some custody and they're on their way to losing more, right? So it becomes extremely difficult for parents to hold on to custody once they start talking about sexual abuse. You know, what's interesting is sexual abuse allegations are done in earnest. They are. 75% of those sexual abuse allegations turn out to actually be true. You know, what happens with the other 25% of that, right? It's that something clearly was going on. Something needed to be gotten to the bottom of. And it turned out to not be grooming. It turned out to not be sexual abuse, or it wasn't their co-parent doing it. Do you see what I'm saying? But if we say that 99% of people who are trying to identify grooming and putting it out there are doing so in earnest, then that goes against, Atra, what we hear all the time. And what the common belief is that parents use sexual abuse grooming allegations to get a leg up in a custody battle. It's not true. It's not true. It's not true. It's made in earnest. And then what ends up happening is you have to figure out what's what. But here's what we know. It's hard to believe that it's happening. It's hard to believe that anyone's capable of it, especially that charming, wonderful co-parent who's sitting across from you. And so for you to accuse that wonderful person who you are in a custody battle with of being a monster makes you look like the monster. That is how the court is looking at it. So we've already talked so much about the amount of documentation and the careful way that you need to advocate it. But the parental alienation claims are going to be the basis for why there's two really big things. One of them is parental alienation. You're absolutely going to be accused of parental alienation if you bring forth accusations without strong evidence of grooming, right? We see it all the time. That's going to be the main thing that's coming in. Of course, there's going to be also she's mentally unstable, that type of thing. But the other big thing is that if children start to talk about the grooming, talk about what's happening to them behind those closed doors, and it's after a parent has said grooming, has said sexual abuse, then that protective parent is accused of putting these ideas into the kids' heads. And so now even the children cannot be believed. Even the children cannot be believed. When they basically are disclosing, it is because the protective parent put the ideas into their heads. That's what we hear, right? So that's what we're often fighting, right, Audrey? You hear about these in your groups as well. Yeah. Basically, the clients are coming forward and saying, I don't understand why my child's being believed. They're saying, I put this into these children's mouths. But again, I'm going to repeat it. 99% of sexual abuse allegations are brought forward in earnest. So if we have the PA claims, that's going to come up. And it's going to be considered interference. And there's just this lack of understanding of grooming dynamics. The family court professionals lack sufficient training or understanding of the subtle and manipulative tactics involved in grooming. So they're going to dismiss concerns if there isn't overt physical or sexual abuse. And proving it is very hard, especially with little kids. Also, they start focusing on high conflict co-parenting is what I'm talking about, where it's the protective parent is part of the problem. Now we have the two problem parents that the court wants, right? And the burden of proof, the skepticism, any kind of these allegations, they require a higher burden of proof. Now, look, on the one hand, of course, we don't want children taken away from loving parents. But if the burden of proof is that high, then we have to ask, what is it that they need to prove it? And it's difficult. The abuser will also really retaliate. They're going to file counter motions. They're going to come up with their own false allegations. They're doing that already, right? So you have to overcome the systemic issues and biases. You have to overcome a lot of these things. And really the way to do it is to be able to say, here's what we have used as successfully as one possible. If you can get somebody else to be the ones to call CPS to raise the concerns, that's going to help. Another place that we really like to tell protective parents to go is that as soon as your child is showing any physical signs of grooming, anything where they're going to need a doctor to take a look, then you want to take them to the doctor as soon as possible after a visit. And of course, you can't frame it what you think it is. Unfortunately, you cannot. Instead, you simply have to talk about the physical symptoms. One of the things I talk about with clients all the time is never label, never diagnose. You don't get to say somebody's anxious. You just have to describe the behavior that shows that they're obviously anxious, but the court needs to decide that they're anxious, right? You don't get to say that there's sexual abuse. Instead, you need to say she's complaining about pain in this area. Could you just check it out? Maybe see what's going on, right? That's what you have to do. We have seen a lot of good pediatricians who, upon doing examination, say, I have to make a report here. But all you've done is you've gone because your child was expressing pain or discomfort, and you just wanted to get them checked out. Once something like that starts getting the ball rolling, then really what you're doing is you're following what everyone then tells you to do. The pediatrician is maybe calling CPS. CPS says you have to take the child here. And so all you're doing is following everyone's instructions. At no point did you accuse anybody of anything. You were just following what everyone is telling you to do and taking care of your child, right? This is the kind of stuff that can help protect protective parents from getting custody whisked away from them, because we have seen it a lot. By the time parents come to us, they've already lost. Either they no longer have primary custody, now they're suddenly at 50-50 just because of the allegations, or they've completely lost custody and they only are seeing their own child maybe once a month or once a week simply because they came forth with the truth of what's going on. And so when we talk about the grooming, we do have to be careful about those kinds of things. Now, look, I want to say very clearly that we're only talking about the tip of the iceberg of everything that we have to talk about. So we hope that nothing is taken out of context, but that you're listening to what we're saying. Obviously, reach out to us so that you can get more direction and more help as you are going through this. But we've talked about the biggest fact and the biggest takeaway for this week as we end is document, document, document. Depend on professionals and let them leave the grooming labeling to the experts. And one last takeaway here, Atra.
Yeah, just slow down. Recognize what's active inside when you begin to start to notice those grooming behaviors so that you can speak from a responsive instead of reactive way. It's hard, but it can be done.
Hard.
Yeah. Next week, join us again, 7 p.m. Eastern. Like or follow us at Brookback so you can get notifications, because what we're talking about might catch you right when you need it, especially this topic.
Yeah. And leave your own comments below. We know there are a lot of stories around this, right?
Yeah.
Talk about what's been going on with you. Talk about what worked and what didn't. What we talk about, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Until next week, when we see you again, stay strong, stay informed, and keep fighting for what matters most. Bye-bye, everyone.
at the front of the